Have you ever noticed how some insults are never shouted? They're whispered, smiled through, hidden behind polite laughter. For years, whenever the Philippines came up in conversations about language, one sentence floated quietly through classrooms, conferences, and corporate meetings. They speak English, yes, but not real English. Not said with anger, not said with cruelty, said with confidence, as if the world had already agreed. And for a long time, many Filipinos heard it and learned to live with it. The idea didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't born out of cruelty or hatred. It didn't need anger to survive. It came quietly, from textbooks that presented English as something already finished, already perfected. From pronunciation guides that circled certain sounds in red and labeled others as errors. From classrooms where accents were measured, corrected, softened, and reshaped until they resembled something approved. It came from accents ranked, like currencies. Some valued higher, some accepted reluctantly, some quietly devalued the moment they were heard. It came from universities where English was treated not as a living language, but as property, owned by institutions, guarded by gatekeepers, certified by diplomas and seals embossed in gold. In these places, English had a center, a birthplace, a standard, and everything else was described as a variation. British English, spoken with authority. American English, confident and expansive. Australian English, relaxed but still legitimate. These were not just accents, they were passports. And then, somewhere at the edges of the map, spoken of in footnotes and side comments, was something else. Philippine English. Functional, they said. Serviceable, they allowed. Useful for call centers, for hospitality, for following instructions, but never standard, never exemplary, never the kind of English that set the rules. It was the English you used to get by. Not the English you used to define meaning. And this belief wasn't taught as prejudice. No one stood at a podium and called it discrimination. No one framed it as bias. It was taught as fact. Printed, lectured, repeated until it sounded neutral. So neutral, in fact, that many never questioned it. And one man believed it more than most. Not because he hated the Philippines, not because he wished to diminish anyone, but because when an idea is dressed as knowledge, when it is wrapped in credentials and reinforced by applause, it becomes invisible. And invisible beliefs are the hardest to unlearn. He had spent his life studying language, not casually, not as a passing interest. It was his life's work. Decades in lecture halls where every word he spoke was written down, underlined, cited. Decades writing papers dissecting grammar, accent, syntax, deciding what made English proper, legitimate, correct. He didn't just teach English, he defined it. Students repeated his theories. Colleagues referenced his work. Institutions reshaped curricula around his conclusions. He was respected, quoted, invited everywhere, from conferences in Europe to symposiums in North America, to panels where decisions about global education were quietly made. When he spoke, people didn't interrupt. They nodded. They agreed. And whenever someone asked him about English in the Philippines, his answer never changed. "It's everywhere," he would say, leaning back slightly, as if stating the obvious. "But it isn't real English, not in the academic sense." The words were never sharp, never cruel. There was no laughter meant to wound, no anger meant to belittle. Just confidence, the kind that comes from never being challenged, from living in rooms where everyone sounds like you, from mistaking repetition for truth. He didn't pause, he didn't doubt, he didn't feel the need to explain. Because in his world, certainty was rewarded, and certainty, when it is never tested, doesn't feel like arrogance. It feels like knowledge, and that is what makes it dangerous. Months later, he accepted an invitation to visit the Philippines. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. A routine engagement, a conference, a few lectures scheduled neatly between other commitments. He packed the same suits he always wore, prepared the same slides he had delivered dozens of times before. He arrived expecting gratitude, expecting curiosity, expecting attentive faces ready to absorb his expertise. After all, this was familiar territory for him. He was the visitor. They were the learners. He expected to teach. The first crack in that expectation appeared in the most ordinary place possible. A taxi. The kind of place where no one performs, no one prepares, no one tries to impress. The driver spoke casually, about traffic, about the heat, about the city's constant movement. The kind of conversation meant only to pass the time. And yet something felt off. The English was fluid, clean, effortless. There was no searching for words, no careful construction of sentences. It wasn't the English of someone trying to sound educated. It was the English of someone simply living, not impressive, not polished, normal, the professor noticed. He paused, if only for a moment, long enough to register the clarity, long enough to feel a faint disturbance. Then he did what certainty always does. He dismissed it. One man proves nothing, he told himself. A coincidence, an exception. Beliefs built over decades don't collapse in the back seat of a taxi. At least, not yet. Then it happened again. At the hotel desk, where a young attendant explained policies and schedules with calm precision, switching seamlessly between guests without missing a word. At the restaurant, where a waiter described dishes not by memorization, but with the ease of someone sharing something familiar. At the airport, where announcements, questions, apologies, and jokes flowed in English without effort or hesitation. Everywhere he went, the same pattern emerged. English that didn't apologize for itself. English that didn't strain or announce its presence. No nervous laughter, no self-correction, no visible effort to sound right. Not rehearsed, not borrowed, used to explain, used to connect, used to live. He felt it pressing against him now, this accumulation of small moments, not loud enough to confront him outright, but persistent enough to disturb the edges of his certainty. Still, he resisted the thought. Coincidence, he told himself. Cities are full of exceptions. Tourist areas attract the educated. Patterns are easy to imagine when you're looking for them. He clung to the comfort of explanation, until he walked into a café. And for the first time, he stopped trying to explain, and simply listened. 3 university students sat arguing over a paper. They weren't speaking loudly. They weren't trying to be heard. Their conversation spilled naturally across the small café table, laptops open, pages marked, coffee growing cold between interruptions. They weren't practicing English. They were thinking in it. They debated ideas, not vocabulary, interrupted each other without apology, corrected logic, not grammar. No one slowed down to find the right word. No one simplified a thought to make it easier to express. One of them quoted a philosopher, carefully, precisely. Another leaned forward and challenged the interpretation, pointing out a flaw in the argument. A third reframed the entire discussion, offering a clearer structure, sharper reasoning. The language bent effortlessly around their thinking. It wasn't careful. It wasn't cautious. It was confident. The professor sat frozen at his table, pen hovering uselessly above his notebook. This wasn't the English of language drills or memorized rules. This wasn't the English of examination halls. This was English as a tool of thought, as a weapon of clarity, as a space where ideas lived and collided. This wasn't classroom English. This was intellectual ownership. And somewhere deep inside him, something shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that it could no longer be ignored. The next day he walked through a crowded market. The air was thick with heat and motion. Stalls overflowed with fabric, fruit, metal and sound. Voices overlapped, bargaining rose and fell, footsteps brushed past one another without pause. Vendors shouted prices, tourists asked questions, deliveries were negotiated in real time. In the middle of it all, a young woman stood behind a narrow stall. She spoke to a local customer in Tagalog without breaking rhythm, turned to a Korean buyer in careful phrases learned through repetition. Then, in the same breath, answered a group of Europeans in clear, confident English. 3 languages, less than a minute. No hesitation, no performance, just movement. English wasn't special here. It wasn't elevated or protected. It wasn't something reserved for exams or boardrooms. It was infrastructure, the invisible framework that allowed strangers to understand one another, the bridge between survival and opportunity, between selling and eating, between staying and leaving. This wasn't academic fluency measured by papers and peer review. This was lived fluency, forged in urgency, sharpened by necessity, and used without apology. And for the first time, the professor felt the weight of a question he had avoided his entire life. What kind of fluency had he been measuring all along? That evening he wandered into a small church. It was tucked between buildings, easy to miss. No grand facade, no imposing doors. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Candles flickered softly, casting moving shadows across worn wooden pews. He hadn't planned to enter. He simply followed the sound. Voices. The prayers were in English, but not the stiff English of ceremony, not the rigid language of memorized lines and formal responses. This English breathed. It carried grief whispered into folded hands, hope spoken softly by those who had learned patience, faith shaped by nights that required endurance. There was no searching for words, no hesitation between phrases. People didn't stumble. They believed in the words. They spoke them as if the language belonged to them, as if it had been claimed, reshaped, and made intimate through use. The professor stood still near the back, afraid to move, because this was not performance, this was devotion, and that frightened him, because language, when believed, when spoken with trust instead of effort, is no longer foreign. It has crossed a border he had never accounted for. That night, alone in his hotel room, the question came uninvited. There was no lecture hall now, no audience, no polite smiles or nods of agreement, only silence. The city hummed faintly. Outside his window, a distant chorus of life continuing without him. He sat at the small desk, notes spread out before him, pages filled with ideas he suddenly no longer trusted. And the question surfaced. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. If English is defined by clarity, by connection, by meaning, then what exactly had he been measuring all these years? Accent, the rounding of vowels, the softening of consonants, origin, the place where a speaker was born rather than the thoughts they carried? Permission, an invisible approval granted by institutions, by history, by people who sounded like him. He realized how rarely he had asked whether language was meant to be owned at all, how often he had confused familiarity with truth. The standards he had defended so fiercely suddenly felt narrow, fragile. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window and felt something unsettling take shape. For the first time, he wondered if what he had been protecting wasn't English, but authority. And that realization followed him into sleep, heavier than any doubt he had ever taught. The conference hall was full. Rows of chairs stretched towards the stage, every seat occupied. Teachers sat shoulder to shoulder with notebooks in their laps. Students leaned forward, alert. Policymakers watched from the back, arms crossed, expressions unreadable. The air carried expectation. He stood confidently at the podium. This was familiar ground. Microphone adjusted. Slides ready. Habit took over. The The cadence of authority returned to his voice. The comfort of repetition settled in. And then he said it. The sentence he had repeated his entire career. The sentence that had never failed him before. In places like the Philippines, English is widely spoken, he said evenly, but it is not quite real English. The words left his mouth smoothly. Too smoothly. Silence followed. Not the sharp silence of outrage, not the chaotic noise of protest. Something colder. A silence that didn't rush to respond. A silence that weighed. He looked up. Faces stared back at him, not hostile, not confused. Steady. Unflinching. Then a woman stood up. She was seated near the middle. A public school teacher, according to the badge hanging from her neck. Simple blouse, worn folder tucked under her arm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for permission. She spoke clearly. "My students recite poetry in English," she said. "They debate in English. They dream in English." Her words were measured, controlled. For them, this language is not theory. She continued. It is escape. It is survival. She paused, not for effect, but because the room had gone still. No one interrupted her. No one looked away. Applause followed. Not loud, not explosive. Firm. The kind of applause that doesn't ask for approval. The kind that doesn't fade quickly. The kind that signals something irreversible has begun. Another voice followed. Younger. Steadier. A student. He stood slowly, not rushed, not defiant. Polite enough to be ignored, precise enough not to be. "You say real English," he began, his tone calm, respectful. "But real for whom?" The question landed gently, almost softly, and yet it cut through the room more sharply than any accusation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. If English is meant to communicate truth, he continued, to explain ideas, to connect people, then maybe real English lives wherever truth is spoken. No flourish, no attempt to impress, just clarity. The room changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The air shifted, as if the audience had leaned forward together. Pens stopped moving. Eyes lifted. The professor felt something unfamiliar press against him. Not anger, not embarrassment, exposure, as if a light had been turned on, not on the room, but on him. And for the first time in his career, he realized he was no longer standing above the conversation. He was standing inside it. He put his notes down. "I came here to speak," he said. "But I realize now, I came here to listen." That sentence did something. It didn't fix everything, but it opened a door. The next day he visited a public school, crowded, worn, alive. Students performed. Poems, debates, speeches, English used with courage, not polish. Then a girl stood up. She read an essay titled "My Voice Matters." She wrote about her parents working abroad, about phone calls across oceans, about learning English so no one could silence her. Her last line, "So when they say Filipinos don't speak real English, I will stand and speak anyway." The professor couldn't move. Authority collapsed. "I was wrong," he told the class. "English doesn't belong to universities. It belongs to people." The room erupted, not in triumph, in recognition. Months later, he stood before the world's most elite audience and said the words no one expected. "I was wrong. Filipinos speak English not as imitation, but as ownership. Perhaps more honestly than we ever did." The world reacted, but the Philippines didn't celebrate loudly. They simply nodded, because they already knew. This story isn't about English, it's about being told, quietly, politely, that you are almost enough, and choosing to speak anyway. So let me ask you, who told you your voice wasn't real? Who made you doubt the way you speak? Think. Dream. If this story feels familiar, share it, because somewhere a child is still learning to speak, not for approval, but for truth. And this time, the world is listening.